these babies look like they're almost done. I'll give that a few more minutes. Okay guys, for today's work, we're going to be doing a little bit of an upgrade to the Cherokee here. Very specifically, it's going to be the WJ swap. Now, there are a lot of things that are entailed with this swap. And a lot of things that should be considered before you do this swap. One of the things is that you're going to need to gather quite a few parts. Some of them will involve going to the junkyard and piecing them out. So that you can accomplish this task. Now, why a WJ swap over a 1-ton steering swap? Well, I'm running 35s here, and I would like to eventually run a bigger tire with this Cherokee. So the stock brakes are not going to be cutting it anymore. As it is, this Jeep has a little bit more of a problem or trouble trying to stop with those bigger 35s, and going anything bigger is definitely going to have more problems. So I want to go ahead and start getting bigger brakes, and one of the ways that to get bigger brakes on these Cherokees is doing a WJ swap. So without further ado, let's see if we can get some of these parts allocated and set up here for you guys to see. Okay, so this is more or less the list of parts, or actually this is the list of parts that you're going to be needing. So to start off, you're going to need to make a trip to the junkyard, and the main thing that you're going to need to be pulling out from the junkyard is going to be your knuckles off of WJ. The knuckles off of WJ have to be from a 99 to a 2004. They can be either front wheel drive, rear wheel drive, or 4x4s. And while you're there, pull out these knuckles. You're not gonna need the ABS sensors that come with these. This especially because this Cherokee doesn't have ABS sensors. But the other thing that you're gonna be wanting to pull is gonna be your calipers, which are gonna be a dual piston caliper, and the brackets that go with it. Now, this is a much larger caliper than the one that comes with the Cherokee, and specifically, you should be looking for this style of caliper. It's an Akebono. This is a dual piston caliper, and some of the later model WJs had this style of calipers or front brake setup. Be careful, because some of the older model WJs, and I say some of them because not all of them got these replaced. They use a Teves style of caliper, which is not going to work out for this swap. This is the caliper that you want. Again, it's the Akebono. Pull both the left and the right side, and go ahead and send them in to your local auto parts store, and get a set of remanufactured calipers, especially if you're pulling them out of a junkyard. I highly recommend that you do that, so that you get fresh new parts into your Jeep. The next thing that you're going to be pulling out of the junkyard is going to be the steering.
Okay guys, I'm going to take a quick pause right here. Now here I mentioned that we pull the parts that pertain to the steering off the WJ. Later on in the video, I find out that these parts are not going to work out. The parts are going to be too big, and they will not fit the XJ. So later on in the video, I do include the parts and part numbers that I used to remediate this situation. So just let you guys know ahead of time, So hope you guys enjoy the rest of the video. Thanks.
The other thing that you're going to be needing is with your calipers, you're also going to need your WJ front brake pads and rotors. The important thing about the rotors is that the rotors need to be re-drilled, and this one I re-drilled them myself from a 5x5 bolt pattern to a 5x4.5 bolt pattern to fit the Cherokee hub. The other thing that you're going to be needing is going to be ball joints. You will need new ball joints at the bottom. If you're there, might as well just replace all 4 of them. And I went ahead and bought this kit. You can choose to buy whatever you want. You can go with an OEM setup for a WJ, and that'll fit the Cherokee so that it accepts these WJ hubs. The other thing that you're going to be needing, and this is more into the aftermarket portion of it, is going to be spacers. Now you have noticed that these hubs or these knuckles already have spacers welded on them, and these are from Iron Rock Off-Road. I recommend that once you buy these, you also buy the caliper spacers, and you need these spacers to accept the Cherokee hub and for these new calipers to fit in properly. You can go about making your own spacers, but honestly, if you just buy them together with this, you should be okay. The other thing that you're going to be needing, and that's very important and a lot of people forget, is going to be a way to mount your track bar setup. Now this specifically, this bracket is from Terraflex. This is for their TJ high steer setup, which uses a similar high steer knuckle on the passenger side, and they sell this bracket separately. This is about $100 more or less, but this fits directly into the Cherokee or the Dana 30 track bar system, or the track bar mounting system. And that is one of the important things that you're gonna need, so that you can move your track bar mounting location from here to a higher position so that it aligns with your new high steer setup. So with all of this this new setup that you're going to be getting, you're going to be getting bigger benefits over a one-ton steering setup. You're going to get bigger brakes automatically, you're going to get a high steer knuckle system, and you're also going to get so before we went ahead and start pulling out the tires and all that stuff, you want to go ahead and set your Jeep up on jack stands. The jack stands are already set in place. You should, if you're doing this kind of work, you should have an idea of where to place these jack stands. You also want to start taking measurements, and since we're changing our steering geometry and all that stuff, I went ahead and more or less started taking measurements from the center of the tire where the mold is at to the other center mold mark on both tires before starting to pull these tires out. I have 24 inches more or less from center of tire to the center of tire, and I used the line of the axle to more or less get a leveled measurement, so I don't measure from up here and try to measure from down there. I know it's a little bit extreme, but you know, it can happen. So I went ahead and measured from this portion right here where it lines up with the axle, and went ahead and measured it out to the other side as best as I could. So the other thing that we need to start doing is start to disassemble the steering system with removing that stock track bar system you see right here. Start welding in that new track bar mounting bracket for the axle side. We need to start getting some of these things out of the way, starting with the steering linkage, and start unbolting some of the track bar components, which would be right here. So for now, I'm gonna go ahead and start disassembling the stock steering setup. This usually comes out as a one piece. It usually always comes out easily. If for whatever reason something doesn't work out, you want to go ahead and keep your steering system intact in case you need to go back to it. At least, you know, that's my thinking. We're gonna go ahead and start disassembling the rest of the steering system as well. You have the other passenger side, the driver's side knuckle, and the pitman arm that we need to start disassembling. So let's start getting to it. I'm gonna go ahead and start removing the cotter pins from here and here. We're going to take off the steering stabilizer and the steering linkage all as one, so that we don't lose some of these parts in the process. Like I was talking about earlier, I'm also going to keep everything together just in case I ever have to go back to the stock steering. I have something to start with. That was both an 18mm nut and bolt in the back. I'm going to go ahead and pull our steering linkage to the side. I'm not going to do the cliche throwing my old linkage out into the yard. So one of the things that we need to start doing is we need to start cutting some of these brackets off. We need to start making some cuts here. Starting cutting the bracket from here at the axle tubes, and slowly start working this portion of the bracketry off. It's gonna get cut here, it's gonna get cut here, and it's gonna, you know, start to pull off eventually and slowly. Don't cut off too much at a time, because, you know, once you start cutting metal, you can't add metal back. We just need to cut the main portions out, and we'll just start test fitting this so we can slowly start to cut metal off of it. So if you have a jigsaw and a grinder, you should be able to do it. So after much fighting and grinding and all that BS, you're able to get the track bar mount off, as well as the steering stabilizer mount that's here, and the sway bar mount as well. The sway bar mount, you don't have to destroy it. You can probably reuse this, which I intend on doing. As you can see, it is very possible to get it out without destroying. So the next thing that we're gonna do is that we've already kind of fitted everything up. I did a little bit of grinding, a little bit of cutting at a time, and the bracket just sits perfectly fine. It sits, sorry about that. It sits perfectly fine. It meets up right there at the bottom of the spring perch. It meets up all the way back here, where I can lay down a couple of welds, and it extends back here, where I can also lay down some welds, and probably from the back as well. And everything has been ground down and cleaned up. So the next thing to do is actually to weld this bracket in place. So let's get to it. Okay, dudes and dudettes, if you're at this point where you're going to be doing a modification and a swap, pulling out your axles and hubs is not something that's out of the ordinary for you, so you know what to do. I'm not going to be separating my axles from the hubs this time. Disconnect your calipers, make sure they don't hang by the cable. We're going to be reusing that cable, your 12.13mm socket, and get those 3 hub bolts out. If you love yourself, you're going to be using plenty of anti-seize, enough to where you can pry these off with your hand. That on both sides. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start getting these knuckles out. Get those 2 castle nuts off the ball joints on both sides, and just beat the crap out of them until they come out. I have a 2-pound sledge on that side that I'm going to be using to beat it here at this point. And we're going to go ahead and go on, and the next thing to do is going to be pressing out those ball joints. Okay, now that the knuckles are off, you want to go ahead and start removing the grease fittings on them, and start prepping up your new WJ knuckles. One thing that is a must for this install, or for this job, is to have a ball joint press. Specifically, you need to have one that has servability for a Dana 30 axle, or any Dana axle as a matter of fact. And it's this tool set right here. That tool set is made by OTC. And this is the set, or the installer tool set. And this is what we're going to be using to uninstall the old ball joints and reinstall the new ones. So it's just a matter of fidgeting around, and I'll get back to you guys as soon as we can. So a quick reference, this is how the ball joint is going to be pressed out. The upper ball joint pushes up to uninstall, and the lower ball joint presses down. So these are 2 pieces, the 2 removal pieces that we're going to be using. In my case, I'm going to use a 7/8 socket to go ahead and start driving this by hand with a ratcheting wrench. And yep. So like I said, this is kind of a fidgety thing to do with one hand. This is how this sets up. You can see the ball joints start to be worked out slowly. Now, if you've never had your ball joints off and you're using this as the first time to change out your ball joints, you might need a couple of extra tools, and one of them being a friend like this to kind of help beat these ones when they don't want to move. You beat the knuckle here, or the C side right here, not too hard. You don't want to go wailing on it to where you're gonna bend it, but enough to where you're gonna hit it evenly on each side to try to loosen up that ball joint. That helps with both upper and lower. This of course is easier when the axle is in the vehicle, because all of this gets held in place by the weight of the vehicle and the suspension of the vehicle. So I suggest using hand tools, because if you go with your impacts right off the back, you're gonna break something. So, or you're very likely to break something. So just take it easy, use your proper tools, and use your PPE, wear some goggles, you know, let's do it. Okay, so this is the setup that we're gonna be using to install the ball joints. Doesn't matter which one you put in first, the knuckle or the actual C portion goes to the top, and this top portion of it stays in the middle on both sides. So you need the adapter, the installer adapter, and the installer cup. The cup needs to sit on the collar. I noticed that the OTC one doesn't sit on this specific brand of ball joints, which are those right there. It doesn't sit perfectly well on that collar, so I had to use the one from the actual ball joint press, but I still use the installer cup or adapter from the OTC kit. Now if you notice, it has a little notch right there, and I try to get it as close as I could to this casting on the knuckle itself, on the C knuckle. See it right there, the casting line right there. It's not perfect, but it kind of helps it align so that the ball joint goes in straight and it doesn't go in sideways, where you can bore out or wallow out your ball joint hole. Other thing that you want to do is go ahead and you can apply some grease so that it doesn't go in too dry, and you want to go ahead and wrench it down until the collar meets the surface of the C knuckle, and that's where you're going to stop. Now it is kind of hard sometimes to get the socket and ratchet where you need it to, so you might have to improvise and grab a crescent wrench, depending on how much lift and etc, etc, etc. So make sure you have that set up like that. Make sure that your adapter is in the correct place, and go ahead and start pressing them in slowly by hand. I would avoid using impacts as best as you could, and yeah, let's get the bottom side down. So the lower ball joint takes a little bit more force than the upper ball joint does, but they both go in fairly smoothly. I use just an open-ended wrench or a box wrench to kind of get in there, because I couldn't get my ratchet under there, and just tighten it. The same thing with the adapters. You see that little notch right there in that little adapter cup? Since there is no casting there, I did my best to kind of align it. I know it kind of got twisted as the whole this whole assembly turns. You also want to go ahead and rotate it towards the direction that it's going to be turning or tightening in this case, so that it doesn't move out of place, or minimally it moves out of place. So you use the installer cup and the adapter for the C portion of the axle, and your ball joint should just drop right in. Might need a little bit of a gorilla strength, but you should be able to get it in. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna put the grease retainer boots, or the grease boots that go onto the ball joint, and then we're gonna start installing the knuckles. So once you get your ball joints pressed in and they're both firmly seated, you can go ahead and start dropping in your knuckles. Your knuckles, you know, are gonna be sitting into these new ball joints. The lower ball joint is gonna be torqued down to 80 foot-pounds, and the top one is gonna be torqued down to 75 foot-pounds. Once you get those holes aligned, if you have to tighten it to align the hole and the castle nut, go ahead and do so. The instructions say not to back the nut out to align it. And go ahead, and even if you go a little bit over the 80 foot-pounds, like, it's fine as long as you get it in alignment. You get your new cotter pins in. Don't reuse old cotter pins, and drop them in and bend them in backwards on both of them. So again, it's going to be 80 foot-pounds, 75 foot-pounds, and the way I tighten it was the bottom ball joint first and then the top one. And the reason is because the ball joint at the bottom is the load bearing ball joint, as opposed to the top one is just an axis for the hub assembly, or the knuckle to rotate on. So the other thing I didn't mention in the other one was that these particular ball joints, the grease fitting goes forward. These are the Alloy USA, so that's how they are. Manufacturer vary, follow the instructions on whatever kit you're using. But yeah, that's what it should start looking like. I'm gonna go ahead and continue this on the other side, and let's keep going. Okay, so right off the back, or you guys are gonna see that I'm not gonna be having these dust shields, because I forgot to swipe them when I was at the yard. So that's something I'm gonna have to do at a later time. But for now, we gotta note that there is gonna be a space issue, or there might not be a space issue. To be honest, I've already kind of completed the other side, and I found that I didn't need some spacers here, and that's gonna be the caliper spacers. So for you guys that are at this point, we are gonna be tightening up all of our bolts, the hub bolts, so we can get some of these things started. Go ahead and tighten them down, torque them down to specs, and we'll get going from there. Apply some anti-seize. You might want to apply some anti-seize to these surfaces here and to the inside of the bolts where they're coming through, so that they don't get stuck when you try to take this apart. Okay, so once your hub bolts are tightened down to spec and you got all that settled in, you want to go ahead and start putting in your new re-drilled WJ rotors. Now here I put on one of the lugs back on, or the lug nuts back on, and using a wrench as a spacer, just so that it can hold everything in place. The next thing that we're gonna do is that we're gonna grab our new WJ bracket and caliper assembly, and we're gonna start separating these things. We're gonna go ahead and start putting on the bracket that holds the caliper on first, before we put on everything. This comes out a little bit different than the stock XJ parts, but it's nothing out of this world. It's a pretty simple thing to do. Now this is where the caliper spacers, or the caliper bracket spacers, would come into play. They were supposed to be these 1/4 inch spacers to go on this side of the caliper here, to space out the caliper outward. For some reason on that side it didn't need it. There was no clearance issue actually, and I'll try to show you on this one, try to reproduce it and see if it's the same thing on this side. Like I said, this is something that might have to get revised, that's what test drives are for. But for now, we're not going to be using the spacer. Doesn't mean that you don't need it, or that you shouldn't have it ready to go if you need it. So with that said, this caliper is what's going to be holding the new brake pads on, and it uses these metal clips that go on something like this. Oops. Opposite side. Was it the opposite side? Can't remember. Oh, there it is. So this is more or less how they sit. And you set those on all the sides. Yep, that's gonna go there. Just like this. Make sure these little tabs sit on the inside, and it should self-center with the outer tab that's here and that inner tab. So this is what's gonna get bolted on. And it's gonna go on this way. These little bolts are gonna go towards the inside of the vehicle, and they're gonna get mounted on with the new caliper bracket bolts to hold it in place. So once the caliper bolts are in place, remember, we're gonna hold off on these spacers. These spacers are supposed to go in between this bracket and the knuckle, or where it attaches to the knuckle. But if you pay close attention, there isn't any more clearance for that. As a matter of fact, there's maybe about an eighth of an inch of clearance on each side. So this is just something that I noticed. I was under the impression that I was gonna need those spacers. I'm not gonna chunk them out, but I will keep that in mind if I do have problems down the road, or when I do a little bit more of a test fitting. So this is how this bolts up. It's 18 millimeter bolt, or bolts that hold this caliper bracket on. And now we're gonna apply the brake pads. So I applied a little bit of a brake grease there in between where the new brake pads are gonna sit, and this is how these ones sit. Honestly, you can use whatever brakes you prefer. These are the ones that I'm gonna be using. That's just my preference. And now these ones need to get pushed in as far as they'll go, and then we're gonna mount the caliper on there. So now that the new caliper is sitting in place, it can get bolted into place. You might have to finesse with it a little bit because these ones want to push out while you're trying to push the caliper on, and for it to sit correctly onto the new brake pads. But it sits onto the new brake pads actually pretty good. So the next thing to do is deattach the brake line from the old caliper and attach it onto the new caliper. Use new copper washers, nice and shiny, and you should be pretty okay. I mean, there's really no fitment issue here. Sits just like the other side. Does not need the caliper spacer, but we're still not done here. We still got to mount up the tire and tie up the steering. So let's get the tire mounted. Actually, I'm gonna put on that that retainer nut and cotter pin that go here, since there was no need to take them out. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna mount up the tire, and then we're gonna start looking at some of the clearances here. Okay, so the tires are mounted on, and I think it's time that we talk about some fitment here. I'm gonna come on this side because this side's a little bit more lit, or the lighting is a little bit easier on the eyes here. So to start off, these are some wheel specs. These are 15 by 10. They are steel wheels. There's some generic Pro Comp wheels that I bought off of four-wheel parts some time back. So enough about that. What's important here is that these have backspacing, and as you guys can see, it is a very, very tight fit in here, and I'm talking very, very tight. So if you see in here, there is about 3/16 of an inch of clearance in there. Ow. Let me get a little bit of lighting. As you guys can see, that is the fitment or the clearance of these calipers with these wheels. These wheels have 3 3/4 inch back spacing, and they are 15 by 10. Now, I suppose the width of the wheel doesn't have anything to do, but the back spacing does. If these wheels had less back spacing, or more back spacing I should say, they probably would make contact at some of the higher points, for example here and maybe up here. If you go to an alloy wheel that is a 15 by 8 or 15 by 10, you might not be able to fit these calipers with those wheels. It might force you to go to a 16-inch wheel at bare minimum, because that is what the WJ runs, the stock. So 15 by 10s, 15 by 8s, 3 3/4 back spacing, you will end up with about 3/16 of a clearance. Now the only other thing that concerns me is that there might be a little bit of a heat entrapment because of you know, this is being so close, you know, the caliper's right there. So this is a bigger brake, you know, with a bigger surface area, so it might be able to dissipate a little bit of the heat a little bit better than the old calipers. So only time will tell. Hopefully I don't run into issues like that. But this is what it looks like so far. Now I still need to do the steering linkage. If you had probably a different design, you'd probably be able to see it more. That's what that looks like, more or less. So let's tie up this steering and let's see what we can get. Okay guys, so it's actually been about a week and a half since the last time I continued filming or shooting video. So what ended up happening was that the steering did not work out as I planned. Ended up having to resort to going back to the XJ steering, which is very unsafe with these WJ knuckles. One thing I learned is that the WJ steering setup is a lot wider than the XJ steering setup. The whole knuckles side to side, they're both longer, and because of that, that brought up a list of problems with this swap. One of it being that the tie rods, the actual metal tie rod that goes from side to side, and the tie rod ends were too long for this XJ setup. The other thing was that the drag link was also too long for this setup. So I managed to modify the tie rod end that goes from knuckle to knuckle to make it fit and accommodate fit itself into this XJ steering. Now it is so modified that I do not want to show that or show anybody how I did that, because I don't think it's safe for anybody to try to do what I did to make it run. Now I am not gonna run that setup because practically I don't feel safe with it. It was unsafe enough that I had to resort to the aftermarket to get what I need to finish my setup. The first one I went with was the drag link. The drag link, even with the modifications that I did to the WJ stock drag link, it would not fit. It was still about 1.5 to 2 inches too long. So I resorted to the aftermarket, and I came across this. This is a JKS part. It is aftermarket. Now, what's great about this is that this is a lot beefier and a lot heavier than the WJ drag link, which is a little bit reassuring. The inner, and this is a hollow tube. It is kind of drilled and tapped to the taper that it is, which is like a metric 24 or something like that. But if you were to able to see the inner diameter is pretty narrow. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you can see that little edge at the bottom there. That's the rest of or what's at the center, which looks to be maybe about 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 of actual complete steel. I'd say a good 1/4 inch of DOM wall right here. 957 number are these 2 jam nuts that are gonna go in there. Now this will use the WJ stock steering ends, so if you guys don't want to use WJ ends or factory replacement ends, then the other option that you really have is to go aftermarket. Whether you want to use a 1-ton steering setup from any manufacturer out there, but I want to use parts that are readily available here at my local auto parts store. So I'm gonna start with these two. These are the ones that are at the drag link. One of them comes off the pitman arm, which is this one right here with the strange bend, and the other one is gonna be the one that connects to the passenger side knuckle, the drag link. Now I'm gonna assemble everything right now. Well, actually I'm gonna get some measurements and I'm gonna assemble everything right now. Let me turn you guys back on in a bit. So I started by putting that rod end at the knuckle and measuring the current center of both tie rod ends. This happens to be 35 inches right on the spot. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna disassemble the pitman arm drag link assembly. I'm gonna start dropping in some measurements, or the rest of this ends. I have already kind of aligned this Jeep here unprofessionally here with a couple of measuring tapes. This drives pretty straight down the road. I just haven't taken it to an alignment, but after this it will have to go to an alignment shop. Let me just finish setting this up. I'm gonna put some anti-seize on these rod ends, put the jam nuts in, and we're gonna go ahead and tighten this up. Okay guys, I think the last time I stopped recording was I was trying to set this drag link up with the measurements, which I did. I ended up using that JKS drag link, and I ended up biting the bullet and getting the tie rod end from JKS as well. These are all Moog tie rod ends, and these are the Grand Cherokee WJ tie rod ends. The reason I went with those is because I didn't want to have to wait on Heims to be shipped in case one of my Heims or any other aftermarket parts failed, and I didn't want to have the Jeep down for that. So with this setup, I can just get parts off the shelf at the parts store, and I should be okay. Now, something else that you guys are gonna see different is my track bar setup. Once I changed this steering setup to a high steer setup, or the high steer with the WJ steering, I also need to do something about my track bar. Now, I skipped over all the parts of how I set it up because there is several ways that you can go about this, and honestly, I'd be just wasting my time trying to show you one way. Look, I'd be pretty stupid of me to tell you if the way that I did this was the only way to do it. There is a number of options out there, aftermarket options that you can use to set up this track bar system, or your own track bar system, I should say. The important thing is two main things that you need to get right when you set up your track bar system. One, you need to have the same angles. The drag link angle, where it pivots here down to over here, needs to match the pivot angle of the track bar. You see that bolt right there and that bolt right there. Not the actual squiggly lines or the bar setup. It has to be a line test from here to here, and you have to get them as close as you can. You also have to consider, and probably the one that people overlook the most, is the length of the track bar in relation to the drag link. This is where most aftermarket options out there fall short. And what happens is that if you look at the frame, or the frame of the Cherokee, the frame ends right there, right up here. And that is exactly where most aftermarket track bar systems finish. And what they'll do is that they'll end up with a track bar system that ends up somewhere more or less where this one ends. And your track bar is still about maybe 6 or 7, maybe probably even more inches shorter than the actual drag link. This setup here, I used an offset track bar mount for the frame, and that is from Barnes 4-wheel drive. It's kind of like a DIY kit. I just bought the bracket and I fabricated the rest of the mount myself. And what that gave me, or that resulted in, was in the track bar being about 1.5 inches shorter than the drag link, and that is from center to center of the drag link. So about 1.5 inches shorter, and it's got the same angle. Now, I will be honest with you, I have already finished the setup. I have already been driving this setup like this. The last time you saw that I was recording, I still had the old Rubicon Express track bar setup. That is no longer in place. There is nothing left of that. So if you have all your correct angles and your lengths, and you use the correct parts, you should be able to drive this about 75-80 miles an hour without any problems, which is exactly what I have. The other thing that I do want to tell you guys is that I do have a little bit of a body roll because of the height of the Jeep and the suspension setup. It is nothing drastic, but you can definitely feel it. Now, I'll later make a video about how I'm going to fix that, but for now, this WJ swap setup is complete. Brakes are bled. Ball joints and tie rod ends are greased, and all my measurements and alignment has been done. And this is a successful upgrade, guys. The other thing that I did mess up on, me personally, because of the way I set this up, is here. I did not take into consideration the bowing of the spring. Now, I did shim the spring, and it needs a little bit more shimming so that I can clear it completely. But you can see where that bolt has kind of bitten through that spring a couple of times. Mostly when it's completely flexed out, or when there's a lot of articulation or movement in the suspension. One of the other things is that I eliminated the sway bar mounts at the axle because of this track bar setup. It was only about 3 or 4 inches of suspension travel with that in there, so now I should have a lot more suspension travel. I still need to bump stop this and get the correct shocks for this, but that'll be at another video. For now, this is the setup. This is something that you guys should consider, is the alignment and the way that this sets up. Also, that you don't hit the pumpkin with the track bar, because now this happens to be a straight track bar. This was also a kit that I bought from Barnes 4-wheel drive, and it uses 7/8 Heims down to a 5/8 with a misalignment spacer, and 9/16 misalignment spacer down there. So this is the setup, guys. Thanks for watching.